You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examination. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, on a Sunday afternoon. As you can tell, they're still renovating the R&T studio. Might be another week. So once again, I apologize for the video and audio quality today. Joined by esteemed and honored guest Rudy Rochman, who is an Israeli Jewish Palestinian activist. You know, I saw some of his videos recently. In fact, it was one called Palestinians and Israelis Listen to Each Other. And I was extremely impressed by how he articulated his position and how very balanced it is. And he's, of course, coming from a little bit of a different perspective than we are as Christians. He, again, is Israeli and Jewish. But I really appreciate where he's coming from on this matter. So I hope that everybody really gives them their ear. And now my other issue I wanted to note is that we have Lewis here, who's going to be joining as co-host. And what we're going to be discussing is the healing of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. Let me go ahead and welcome you to the show, though, Rudy. How are you?
I'm great. I'm here in Jerusalem, so can't complain.
You're in Jerusalem right now? Yeah. Okay, I thought you were going to be in the United States. Wow.
No, I'm in Jerusalem, and we actually just finished the fast day today, so it was
I envy you. I used to live in Jerusalem, and then also in Mevaseret Zion, you know, right outside of Jerusalem, among a few other places. And I miss it. I want to go back so bad. So do you live in Jerusalem normally, or are you in the United States?
I live in Jerusalem, and occasionally for different things I travel.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Well, you know, before we dive into the topic, maybe tell me a little bit more about that. Just a quick bio on yourself.
Sure. I have a little bit of a complex story because I moved around and lived in many places growing up, which sort of played into how I've understood my own identity, the identity of my collective, and played also a role into the work that I do. So I was born in France. My mother's side of the family was born in Morocco and Algeria. There was a massacre of the Jewish community of Rudys in Morocco in 1948 as a retaliation to the creation of Israel. The family after that ended up fleeing to France. On my father's side of the family, they came from Poland and Belgium. And while they were there, obviously during the Holocaust, there were persecution and exterminations, and they fled to France and hid in attics to survive the war. So both of my parents were first generation born in France, and my grandparents, which had been born in all different types of countries, were persecuted for not being a part of those countries. So I grew up with the understanding that in Morocco, we were not Moroccan, we were Jews. In Algeria, we were not Algerian, we were Jews. In Poland, we were not Polish, or in Belgium, we were not from there either. We were Jews, and we were killed for not being Jews, for not being of that place, but of being Jews. Left France at the age of 3, moved to Israel, then moved to Miami at the age of 5. And particularly growing up in Miami, it's a mix of different cultures and identities, particularly from Latin American backgrounds. So growing up in elementary, middle school, high school, I had friends and peers that were from Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica. And even if they were first, second, third generation born in Miami, they still identified by where their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents had come from. So automatically going to school, I was labeled the French kid, since my parents had thick French accents, and that's where I had been born. And when I'd visit family in France, I was the American cousin, and I was also Jewish, and I'm also connected to Israel, and I'm also Israeli. And you know, even within Jewish culture, there's Ashkenazi and there's also Sephardic, and my mother's Sephardic, my dad's Ashkenazi, but I was raised fully Sephardic. So constantly, there's been an identity crisis going on within my life and with my sense of identity, not in me not understanding who I am, but me not knowing how to express myself to someone else. Because whenever someone would ask me, where are you from, or who are you, I was supposed to give a different answer depending on who was asking me the question or where the question was being asked. And that led me to being very frustrated with not being able to express myself to what I felt connected to, and rather needing to find answers for what other people expected. Everything changed, and I sort of became an activist at the moment that I was activated at the age of 7. I took a trip to London with my mom and my younger brother, and I got kicked off of a bus with my mom for being Jewish by a neo-Nazi bus driver, physically kicked off the bus. When that happened, it sort of taught me that it doesn't matter, it didn't matter where I was born, grew up, lived in, traveled to, resided in, what passport I had, I was a Jew. And I started to look deeper into what it means to be a Jew. But before that, it also taught me that the next time that I experience any form of injustice when it comes to my collective, or really anything that I would see as unjust, I'd have to be prepared. I couldn't allow myself for another situation like that to happen where I wasn't either physically prepared, mentally prepared, psychologically prepared, emotionally prepared, or even ideologically ready for that type of situation. So going deeper into the question of what does it even mean to be a Jew, I realized that Judaism is actually not a religion. Because when we look at religion, it's a belief system in a God, deity, book, or prophet. So in order to become a part of a religion, you have to accept the deity, and while accepting the deity, you become a part of the religion. With Christianity, you accept Jesus, you dunk yourself in water for some practices, and then you become a Christian. For Islam, you accept Muhammad in the Quran, you do a certain ritual with cleaning your ears and your hands and your feet, and you become Muslim. If you self-identify as Buddhist, it's because you're accepting the philosophies of Buddha. And if you reject Jesus, then you're no longer a Christian. If you reject Muhammad, then you're no longer Muslim. If you reject the philosophies of Buddha, then you don't identify as a Buddhist. So a religion is based on an individual believing or not believing in something. And when it comes to Judaism, let's look at the Jewish people. Regardless as if a Jew, an individual, believes or doesn't believe in the Torah and in Hashem, which is our Old Testament, and the name of God, which is Hashem, 72 names, but that's one of them. That doesn't matter, because they're still just as much Jewish as anyone else. It's not based on your observance level or your choice in accepting the belief system aspect of that tradition. And also, to become a Jew, you don't just say, I accept Hashem and the Torah, and you become a Jew. You have to go through years of a process of adopting an identity, a history, a culture, a value system, a connection to a land, aspirations, the suffering that comes along with being a part of that people. So it's way more than a belief system. And actually, if we compare it to other peoples like the Native Americans, Native Canadians, Tibetans, Yazidis, Kurds, Aboriginals, Maoris, Mayans, Aztecs, those peoples all had spiritual practices and religious practices, yet we did not consider them religions, because they were an ancient civilization and indigenous people connected to a land that also had spiritual elements. Whereas a religion is only a belief system for any people. Judaism is not only a belief system, and it is for one people. And the Jewish people are the descendants of that civilization. And we created Judaism as a sort of portable suitcase to pack in everything about who we were and how we lived and what we aspire to do, pass it down generation to generation with the aspiration of next year in Jerusalem, coming back home and reviving that. So that's sort of what started everything for me. You know, graduated high school at the age of 17, joined the army in Israel, served as a paratrooper, and then started university at UCLA before transferring to Columbia University. And that's sort of where my activist on the intellectual space started, with all the anti-Israel and anti-Jewish movements on college campuses and in intellectual spaces. And eventually it's grown with a lot of video work and things that I do on the ground, building relations between Israelis and Palestinians, trying to heal our world, because at the end of the day, we're all a part of one. And regardless of our differences, we have to be able to use our unique differences to be able to achieve something greater for all of us. So that's something that I very much still believe in. So yeah, that's kind of how my work started and where it's gone.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like one of the emphasis that I noticed from you is that you want to make sure that the Israeli people never forget what happened, so that, you know, things in the past that happened, so that they won't happen again in the future. Kind of like the Shoah, you know, with the issue in the Holocaust there. You always have that one day of the year where the sirens go off and you remember, and you're quiet and you remember what all happened, so that you never forget and what happened in the Holocaust, and it prevents it from happening again in the future. If you're aware of it, that definitely helps prevent it. Is that kind of an emphasis in what you're trying to do?
I would say that's one element of the work that I do, and I would go even deeper. There are usually two phrases used to commemorate the Shoah. It's never forget and never again.
Yeah.
And we never forget for a reason. And we say never again doesn't mean it's not going to happen because we say it. It's to make sure we make the commitment and take the actions to take the responsibility that it never happens again, meaning understanding how the Holocaust led to what happened. It didn't happen overnight that Jews were a part of society and the next day they're being burned in ovens and gassed in chambers. There was a decade of a rise of anti-Semitism where society eventually came to that conclusion. And the Holocaust wasn't the first one, it was just the latest one. There are many times the Spanish Inquisition, the pogroms, the Black Plagues, plenty of times that Jews had been exterminated, persecuted, oppressed. And every single time we tend to say never again, but we sort of allow anti-Semitism to rise. We don't narrate our own story. We don't take the power into our own hands. So that's a big part of what I do with my work amongst the Jewish people, is to try to empower the next generation for us to know who we are, know our purpose, be strong, not be afraid, narrate our own story. And when it comes to the work that I do between Israelis and Palestinians, it's more to wake both collectives up that the experience of the other has been one that was always fed to us and given to us with a perspective that every single other person on the other side represents your demise, meaning you can never achieve your aspirations as long as the other succeeds. And that very mindset is what even caused the animosity in the first place, which then results in the consequence of violence and oppression that is experienced. And so if we want to heal and remove the physical walls that exist, we have to first heal and remove the psychological walls.
Before we dive into the issue with Israelis and Palestinians, let me ask one more quick question. You mentioned there was a decade or so of things that happened leading up to the Holocaust, or rise in anti-Semitism. Do you think some of those signs are present today?
Absolutely. And I can share from personal experience. There's a trip that many Jews do when they're usually in high school called March of the Living. It's a trip where they go for 1 week in Poland and visit extermination camps, concentration camps, and learn all about what happened there, but learn more so interactively while you're there in person. And one thing that my trip did when I was 17 years old is they printed us a packet while we were on the bus, for hours or sometimes on place to place, a packet of letters of Jewish leaders at the time prior to the Shoah, in the decade before, what they were writing to each other as anti-Semitism was rising. Meaning rabbis, community leaders, presidents of communities, presidents of organizations, what were they writing to each other about the situation getting worse for the Jewish people? And the things that I read were basically, don't do anything about it, it'll just get worse. If you do something, just stay and it'll just go away by itself. Or no, we need to side with Hitler and the Nazi party because anyways, he's going to be the chancellor and he's going to be in power. So might as well support him financially. So at least we have a relationship with him. And this mindset is a mindset based from trauma. When you take a situation, when someone's dealing with trauma, they can fight it head on and deal with it. They can make excuses for it, or they can blame themselves for their own trauma. And so this is part of the second one, where they were making excuses for the situation and not taking responsibility to make sure that anti-Semitism didn't rise. Because we all know that there's always going to be forms of xenophobia for all communities. There's always going to be hatred against people of color. There's always going to be hatred against women. There's always going to be hatred against Jews. That's just the nature of currently the world we live in, where there are others, and naturally there are individuals which reject and have xenophobia towards the others. What's important is to keep pop culture and the mainstream to make sure that that's something recognized by the vast majority and educated to future generations that those ideas are bad and those individuals are doing bad things. And the Jewish people have not taken on the responsibility to get in pop culture, understand first who are the Jewish people, where are we from, where we desire to live, what are our aspirations, how do we understand us compared to other peoples and other traditions, and also what is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is very different than racism. It's similar in the sense that it's xenophobia, but it's very different. So what is systemic anti-Semitism? We need to be able to define it to society for society to recognize it, and then to be able to take actions against it. But if we don't even recognize it and define it ourselves, we can't expect others to be able to recognize and stand up against it. So I do see those patterns happening today that have been happening for the past 15 years in America, especially on college campuses, and not only in America, really all around the world, with a lot of demonization of the Jewish people, blaming the Jewish people from the far right to the far left. The far right will blame the Jewish people for the immediate wrongdoings or the problems of a society. So economic situation post-World War I, blame that on the Jews. Coronavirus, we heard a lot of far-right people blaming the Jews for that. Anything that's like affecting a community right now, blame that on the Jewish people. That's on the far right. On the far left, it's similar but a little bit different. The left's values are usually values of human rights, justice, liberation, minorities. That's what the left usually champions itself on pursuing. And the far left will basically take the elements that they recognize that their own society has done wrong, such as apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, colonization, slavery, racism, and they will take all these terms and bad ideas and bad things that their own society has done, and instead of dealing with it, they take it and they place it onto the Jewish state, onto Israel, which is why it's very similar to the extreme right's form of anti-Semitism, but the extreme left's form of anti-Semitism is taking the actions that a society has taken against the values of the left and then placing those same ideas onto the Jewish state and the Jewish people.
Now, let's go ahead and dive into the topic itself. Kind of give us just a basic introductory crash course on what are the reasons behind the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, because like I said, most of my viewers are going to be Christians, and so they're not generally familiar with what's going on in the Middle East, unfortunately. So maybe give us just some basics.
Sure. So let's start with the identities of both peoples, because I think this is where a lot of people don't understand the identities of Israelis or Palestinians and then tend to confuse how to view the situation. Israelis or Israelites or Jews or Hebrews, I'm not talking about those that have an Israeli citizenship, but those that come from Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, the children of Israel, are the descendants of an ancient civilization, an indigenous civilization from the Levant, from the land of Israel / Judea. This civilization has existed for 4,000 years, and it was colonized 2,000 years ago by the Roman Empire. Now, the Jewish people then, the Judeans, were fighting the Roman Empire and sort of kept fighting them and weren't losing for a certain amount of years. In fact, they even printed coins that were showing that we were free of Rome for several years before eventually Rome destroyed us, which echoed humiliation across the Roman Empire that the Judeans, this small little nation, were sort of fighting off the strong Romans and beating them. So when they destroyed our civilization, they did many things, such as change the names of our cities, such as Shechem, they changed it to Neapolis, which with time eventually became Nablus, but originates from Neapolis, and also changed the name of the land to Palestine. Now, why did they change the land of Judea to Palestine? Where does this word even come from? Well, for those of you who mostly in the audience are Christian, I'm sure you've read the Bible and have come across the term the Philistines. The Philistines were an ancient people from the island of Crete off of Greece that were sort of the Vikings of the Mediterranean. They believed in several different gods, and their function was basically to rape and pillage and loot different villages and civilizations across the Middle East. Eventually, they became part of the Greek Empire, but this is prior to the Greek Empire. And the Jewish people had many different skirmishes with the Philistines. In fact, we know the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was a Moabite general in the Philistine army, and we know the story of Samson and Delilah. Delilah was a woman, part of the Philistine people. So we clearly see this theme happening where the Jews and the Philistines are having wars. Eventually, King David comes, and the Philistines eventually either assimilate or defeated or go back to Greece, eventually assimilate to what becomes the Greek Empire, but they are sort of no longer relevant in history and no longer mentioned, and there's no more traces for them. However, Philistine, in the Hebrew word plishtim, means in Hebrew invaders, because that's what they actually were. They were invaders. So the Hebrew word for their name is invaders. And when the Romans colonized our land and our civilization, they decided to name our land by the name of one of our former greatest enemies, which were the Philistines. And Palestine, literally in Hebrew, from the Torah, from the Bible, means invaded land. Now, does that mean that today's Palestinians are invaders and that when they say Palestine, they're talking about invaded lands? Absolutely not, because the Palestinians of today are not the Philistines of then. What happened for 2,000 years after the conquest and the colonization of the Roman Empire onto Judea is that this land was called Palestine for 2,000 years. The majority of Jews were forcibly expelled, taken into slavery in Rome, and expelled all around the world, which is why you find Jews all around the world today. It's not because a religion spread to those areas. It's because the physical people were forced out of those areas and continuously spread due to anti-Semitism and persecution. And for 2,000 years, you had people that were Jews. Also, Islam was born 500 years later, and eventually Islam poured into that land. Christianity was formed shortly after and also spread into that land. And so you had groups of people with different identities, with different belief systems that mostly lived in a land that was called Palestine. Now, this land called Palestine was always controlled by a foreign empire. It went from being the Romans to the Byzantines to the Crusades and the Caliphates, the Ottomans, and eventually the British. Never was there a country since Judea. It went from being Judea, colonized by the Roman Empire, called Palestine, and eventually freed from the British in 1948 and renamed to Israel, which is actually the historic name. Now, unfortunately, today we have Israelis and Palestinians that are fighting each other. Now, why is that? Well, in my opinion, and there are many people who believe this to be true, is that the British Empire did the same thing that they did to the Arabs and the Jews, the Israelis and the Palestinians, that they did in India and Pakistan, that they did in the ethnic groups in Nigeria or the ethnic groups in Afghanistan, which is divide and conquer. This was the MO of the British Empire. Rather than having the local people fight them, let's find a way to divide the people on the ground and find ways for them to fight each other, so they're fighting each other rather than fighting the British Empire. And that's exactly what they did to the Jews and the Arabs. They convinced the Arabs, which eventually today are all identified as Palestinians, they convinced them that their source of the problem and their future problems will come from the Jewish presence in the land. And they convinced the Jewish side that the Arabs and the Palestinians just wanted to destroy them all and there was no way to live together. And so rather than creating a civilization here that would allow both Palestinians and Israelis, Jews and Arabs to fulfill their aspirations and to build a civilization that would work for both, they ended up fighting each other in 1948, again in 1967, again in 1973. And we've sort of been seeing the consequences of those wars against one another today, which has resulted in an unjust status quo. And still to this day, we're living in these mental bubbles where a large portion of both populations still understand the situation as the reason for why we suffer is the other's existence. And until the other disappears or is destroyed or we win over the other, there is no way that we can actually achieve our aspirations. And what's important to me in my work is to really focus on what are those actual needs. What are the needs of the collective of the Palestinians? List them to me. Go 1, 2, 3, until you find no more needs or think of no more needs. And let's do the same thing for Israelis. And let's build a reality, work together. I mean, it's not happening overnight and it's not going to come from a resolution or a piece of paper. It's a gradual process that takes a lot of time and there are obstacles to go through. But as long as we have an idea of what kind of reality we want to move towards, we need to first understand the needs that both people have as part of their aspirations. We need to also understand the injustices that both experience that have to be solved. And they're different for both peoples on both ends, the aspirations and the injustices that are experienced.
Louis, I know you're hanging out in the background there. Why don't you jump in with any conversations you have?
I just wanted to say that I've actually seen firsthand a lot of the paranoia that you've mentioned regarding Jews being behind everything, because I'm actually one of the main moderators in Reason and Theology's Discord channel, and every once in a while, some of the more interesting fellows in the chat channel there will always find some reason to say, oh, the Jews are up to no good again. And I always have to rein them in, saying, you know, you don't have to find a Jew behind every bad thing that happens, but they seem determined to do it. And I have to admit, I've seen a lot of crazy conspiracy theories regarding the coronavirus, but the pinning that on the Jews is new to me. I haven't heard that one yet. Now, as for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this is something that I've paid attention to on and off for the better part of the past 10 years or so, and I've sort of swung around on both sides, like having looked at it, and it's very difficult to like balance out both perspectives. So one of the main reasons why I'm here is because we were originally going to get a Palestinian person on here to give their perspective on the issue, but unfortunately we were not able to. So I'll try my best to like present a perspective that's more sympathetic to theirs. And I have to say that, like, I'm just curious, like, would you say that to a certain extent, the reason why the conflict has dragged on as long as it did was because there are people on both sides that really do not want to hear what the other side is saying. Like, they're not interested in um, coexistence, like both on the Arab side as well as on the Jewish side. Like, would you say that it's a two-way street in that regard?
Yeah, so I would not say that it's equal, because there's some good elements of one side that don't exist on the other, and some bad elements on one side that don't exist on the other. So it's not completely equal. But the reasons for why we haven't been able to move forward is because there is a minority of individuals who are bad in their thoughts and their ideas, and then also in their actions, who have a sort of sense of control over pop culture and education and the news that we receive on both sides that exist, which then causes the population to not even entertain the idea that living with the other is even possible. In my opinion, anyone who's anti-Palestinian or anti-Israeli is actually anti both peoples. There's no reality where either population will disappear. So as long as you're pushing a zero-sum game narrative that one will exist and the other will cease to exist, or one will win and the other will lose, that will never happen. So I definitely agree with that. And I'll go even further. We cannot blame the consequences of the wars that were waged to ethnically cleanse the Jewish population since 48 with 67 and then 73, and blame the consequences of those wars solely on the Jewish people. But we can today look at the situation and realize that today wasn't the case in 48, wasn't the case in 67, wasn't the case in 73, but today the reality is that Israel is much stronger. And with its strength and with its power, there's a responsibility. And in my opinion, one of my biggest critiques of the Israeli government is it's not using its power in order to take responsibility over the situation and change the status quo. The status quo does not get to be blamed on the Jewish people or on Israel, but Israel today has the responsibility to change it because it has the power. And I would say the same if the Palestinians were in power today and there was a status quo, and there couldn't be blame on them for causing the status quo, but with that power there would come a responsibility. And that's one of the biggest critiques I have of the Israeli government for the past 20-something years.
Well, it's not just the Israeli government, because there are also certain factions, right? Like, Israel has its own far right, like, followers of Kahane, or like some of the more radical.
Those are very minor. In fact, Kahane's party in the Knesset is actually banned from the Knesset. So the pop culture and the vast majority of people reject that ideology, but do individuals like that exist? Absolutely, and they exist on all sides.
Yes. Yeah. To what extent would you say that sort of ideology like exerts control, like more in the general populace, like the average Israeli?
The average Israeli, if you bring up Kahana or you bring up one of these groups that kind of take the ideas of Kahana, they'll laugh at you and they'll insult you and they'll completely reject you. It's part of pop culture to reject such extremist ideas, but unfortunately it's not yet part of pop culture to have a more holistic understanding of the situation, of understanding the identities and the experiences of the other. But there's no taught hatred in pop culture that exists, in my opinion.
Okay. I'm just curious, because I know that in some of your videos, you've expressed some interesting perspectives that I don't hear very often from people coming on the Israeli side. For example, you have this one video where you mentioned the fact that the walls and the checkpoints need to come down at a certain point, and that's not something that I usually hear from people who, want to make a defense of Israel's policy. So I'd like to hear you elaborate on that particular point a bit more.
Sure. So first of all, I'm not a government official, so I'm not here to defend Israel's policies. I'm an Israeli, I'm a Jew, and I'm an activist, and I'm also very pro-Palestinian. And so my work is based on trying to reject lies and show truth, spread light where there is darkness, and try to create unity and push forward a reality that can exist. Now, I think a lot of people need to understand how the peoples of this land, and also Palestinians, see this as well, how we view this. We don't view it as a piece of territory or property that you can buy, sell, and trade. We see it as our soulmate. And there's the story of King Solomon, who wasn't only a king, but was also a judge, where there were two mothers that come to his court, and both claimed to be the mothers of a baby. And King Solomon does not know who the mother is because obviously there's no DNA test back then. So he says, you know what, I'll take the baby, I'll cut him in half, and one mother will get one half and the other mother will get the other half. And you have one mother that says, sure, fine, we'll do it, I'll get half and that'll be fair. And you have the other mother that says, no, it's actually not my baby, it's her baby. And that's how King Solomon was able to see who the real mother is, because a real mother would never cut her baby in half. And that's the same thing that we need to understand when we look at this land. People who are truly indigenous to this land do not believe it cannot be cut in half. And that exists for both the majority of Palestinians and the majority of Jews. Now, the walls and the checkpoints is not about necessarily cutting the land eternally and forever. It's about currently dividing where there's another population because of our experiences with terrorism and because of our, I think, the manipulation of information that a large portion of Palestinians, all that they want to do is just go and kill people, which is not the reality for the vast majority of Palestinians. So I'm against the checkpoints because I think, one, it divides the land that shouldn't be divided. Two, it's not a long-term solution, which actually causes a lot of injustices and a lot of separation. Most Palestinians prior to the wall spoke Hebrew because there were Jews that were coming in and interacting and speaking Hebrew, and they would be able also to go in other places, even though they weren't able to live in other places, just like we wouldn't be able to live there. There was at least some sort of interaction. And today, the younger generation mostly doesn't speak Hebrew because that interaction doesn't exist anymore. Now, there are other things today that are actually allowing us to cross those walls, ironically, like, for example, TikTok, which is a social media platform that usually Gen Zers are using. But with TikTok as a social media application, it also gives you videos of people that are in close proximity to your region. So actually, through apps like TikTok, Israelis and Palestinians are able to experience each other's expression, communication, go in each other's lives, and actually interact with one another. However, I think the wall has done a lot more harm than it potentially has done good. There are some people that claim that when the walls were put up, that 90% of terrorism decreased. I think a big reason for why terrorism decreased after the Second Intifada is because the Second Intifada ended. The Intifada did not continue. I think that's many other things like surveillance and security that had increased also took role in making that terrorism decrease. But if we look at the wall, the vast majority of it is a fence. And there are plenty of places that is still wide open where people can cross, and people do cross every single day, morally, in my opinion, but illegally according to law. So the reality is that I don't think the walls actually provide us with the security that most people tend to think that it does. And regardless of if it does provide us with some security, which I'm sure it does have at least some security, I do not think it's something healthy for the long term for both peoples, and definitely not a reality that we would both want to see.
Yeah, I do find it interesting because originally the walls were probably like a response to radicalism, but the wall itself has been a source of increasing radicalization to an extent. So it's sort of like a vicious feedback loop in a way. I'm also curious about your view of the settlements, because that is a hot button issue whenever the Israeli-Palestinian conflict comes up. And I always hear about how the settlements tend to cause a lot of tension between the Palestinians and the Israelis who've settled in the West Bank.
Yeah, so first of all, I think that this is a very false claim because it's not as if prior to 67, where there were no settlements, as you call them. I don't think that they're called settlements. It's not as if there was no war and no conflict between populations. So to say that the reason for why Jewish villages in Judea and Samaria is the reason for why there is conflict is as if someone's saying that the reason there's conflict is because there are Arabs living in Israel. So I think that this claim is completely false. And I want to touch on the actual terminology of settlements. What does settlements mean? It means a community built by settlers, and settlers are foreigners. So naturally, by calling Jewish villages in Judea, the place of where Jews come from, the reason we're called Jews is because we come from this land that historically has been called Judea. To consider us being the settlers and our villages being settlements when most of those villages are actually built on ancient ruins of Judean, of our ancestors' villages, is ridiculous. It's like saying that Native Americans rebuilding a community that was destroyed is a settlement, or Tibetans going back to Tibet is a settlement. When Palestinians are building in the land, they're not considered a settlement. So it's not even about being a new village, it's about it being a Jewish village. So I think that using the term settlements is completely wrong. and then gives this nature of the Jews being foreigners, which is a constant stereotype, like a trope that has been used against the Jewish people to delegitimize our connection to the land and our rights to also live there.
Yeah. I think one of the arguments that people would raise regarding the settlements is the Oslo Accords indicated that that land would belong to the Palestinians, so the settlements would be a violation of the Oslo Accords.
Well, a few things. First of all, the Oslo Accords happened in 1993. After the Oslo Accords, you have the interim agreement of 1995, which agreed that Israel would be able to build in Area C. The West Bank, Judea, and Samaria is divided into Area A, B, and C, and Jews are only building in Area C. We cannot live and build in Area B, and Jews can't even access and go personally into Area A, where there are many of our holy sites as well. And even if we go after 93, there are many things that were broken in that accord that happened, where there should be no more terrorism, where we had intifadas afterwards, many things that happened afterwards. So again, the idea that Jews should not be able to build in Judea or Palestinians cannot be able to build in what is today Israel proper is, in my opinion, injustice. This is one land that both peoples are connected to in different ways, and we should all be able to live on this land as equals in a way that achieves the aspirations of both peoples, and the limitation of building for either peoples is injustice, in my opinion.
That's fair enough, but what do you do with like the fact that, for example, I've seen news stories where occasionally Palestinian olive orchards would get burnt down. And there's also that whole question of like people getting evicted once in a while. I know that Hamas used that as a pretext for launching their recent attacks.
Yeah, so there's no excuse to individual going and burning the fields, the olive fields of other human beings and other individuals that are living in the land. That's a horrible crime, and that person should be punished for the value of that crime, meaning probably sitting in jail for a few years, and making sure that something like that doesn't happen, and pushing policies for things like that to be limited. So I'm not in any way going to justify or excuse that action. I'm completely against that. In terms of evictions, and even more so something you didn't bring up, demolitions, which also exist, we have to break down why, not just the what. We have to understand why things are happening. Because if you care about the what, then you must also care about the why in order to change the what from happening. With the current situation that happened with the recent conflict, war, the thing that was happening right now with Sheikh Jarrah is where it started. We're talking about 8 homes. And those 8 homes were owned and purchased by Jews that were living in a community next to Sheikh Jarrah called Shimon HaTzadik. It was called Shimon HaTzadik because Shimon is a person, HaTzadik is a righteous person. Shimon HaTzadik, righteous Shimon person, was a big rabbi that lived and is buried in that area. And so you always had a Jewish community living in that area. In 1948, the Jordanian army took over the entirety of the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria, including Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem, including Sheikh Jarrah, and ethnically cleansed and removed every single Jew from the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria, including in Sheikh Jarrah, and including in those 8 specific homes that we're talking about. Those homes were then allocated to Jordanian families because the king and the military decided to give these homes to some of the families that were friends with the leadership. And those families were then renting out those homes to Palestinian families that were living there and earning rent money on those homes, passive income. Now, if we fast forward from 1948 till 1967, in 1967, there's the 6-Day War where Jordan and the surrounding Arab countries attack Israel in an attempt to ethnically cleanse the Jewish population. Yet again, they fail in that war, and Israel liberates Judea and Samaria, liberates the Golan Heights, and liberates the Gaza Strip and also the Sinai. And in the process, also liberates Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is within that territory that Jordan was in control. Those families then go to the Israeli courts and stated to the courts, listen, here are the deeds of our homes. These are our homes that we owned less than 20 years ago. And we would like to have the ownership of our homes back. Those Jordanian families that are still touching on the rent and owning our homes are not the rightful owners. The court case went till 1982. So from 67 to 82, there was due process. There were people that came to the courts to figure out the actual situation. And eventually the court ruled, you know what? These homes were owned by Jews and they were wrongfully stolen by the Jordanians. However, today there are Palestinians living in them. So what we will do is we will allow the ownership to go back to the Jews. However, the residency would be allowed to be respected and protected for the Palestinians living there, as long as they would continue paying the same rent that they were paying to the Jordanian families, now to the Jewish families. And since that day, they stopped paying rent. So since 1982 till today, we're talking about almost 40 years. For 40 years, these families have not been paying rent to the rightful owner of those homes. And there were many court cases and appeals, and again, letting them know that if they don't pay rent, they'd be evicted. There are even settlements that were tried to be processed in court saying, we'll give you subsidies to living somewhere else, we'll give you money. There were attempts to find a solution that would work for both, but the lawyers of these 8 families were the lawyers of the Palestinian Authority, and they rejected any attempt of any sort of negotiation to finding a solution. And eventually, some of those families have been evicted for living in those homes. If that situation was happening in reverse in any other way, I would also take that as a, in any society that you're living in, if you're owning a property and you're renting out your property and your tenants don't pay your rent, the landowner, the apartment owner, the house owner should be protected under the law. So that's the reality of the situation. Now, in terms of demolitions, there's demolitions of homes that are built illegally, and this applies both to Jews and to Palestinians. The city of Amona was demolished, a Jewish city, because it was built illegally on land that was owned by Palestinians. It's not illegal because it's Jewish, it's illegal because they didn't own the lands. And so when a house or a structure or a city or a community is built illegally, either by Palestinians or Jews, it is demolished and removed. And also there's another policy that I actually disagree with that Israel does, which is home demolitions for terrorism. And the reason for why Israel has created that is because the Palestinian Authority incentivizes terrorism. Any person that goes and kills an Israeli civilian, in fact, if they kill a woman or a child, they get paid more. And if they kill more than one person, they get paid more. They get a monthly salary to either them if they survive or to their families if they die in the process. And so the Palestinian Authority incentivizes the murder of civilians. And so the Israeli government decided to enact another policy in saying, if you commit an act of terror, your home would get demolished. And so it has proven to decrease the amount of terrorism through this policy. But at the same time, the wife or the husband and the children and the grandparents and the brothers and sisters that are living in this house, they're not responsible for the crime that that individual did, and they end up being suffering. So it's sort of a collective punishment, which, yes, might decrease terrorism and the desire of people to do so because of the fear of the repercussions. However, you're creating sort of hatred within another 10, 20, 15 people that are living in that same house because of their experience. So I'm against collective punishment. I understand why this policy exists, although I'm against it. But anyone talking about this demolition policy in response to terrorism better mention the family that was massacred with a knife on Shabbat in their house because they were Jewish, and that's why the home is getting demolished. You can't talk about that without talking about the other.
By the way, do you have, for somebody who might be new to this discussion, something to substantiate this claim that, the Palestinian authorities will give this incentive to somebody who does this to Israelis?
Absolutely. Anyone can look it up. It's nothing that's hidden at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, what would you say are some of the main legitimate grievances that each side has? Maybe if you could lay a few out.
Sure. So let's start with the Jewish side. The Jewish people believe to be an ancient civilization from this land that have always aspired and attempted several times throughout history to return back to their lands. In 1948, we finally succeeded in doing so by kicking off the British Empire. Following that, we were attacked by all the surrounding sides. Many people have been killed not only from war, but also terrorism. I have 6 friends that have been killed either from war or from terrorism. And I can guarantee you that every Israeli knows someone or knows someone that has been killed due to war or terrorism. So it's a reality that we experience. And we tend to be constantly attacked, whether physically or ideologically, by people either in the land or internationally for our own legitimacy and our identity and our right to exist. We're not able to live in parts of our land, like in Area A. We can't even access Area A. We can't even access Al-Aqsa. For us is the Beit HaMikdash, the Temple Mount, which is our holiest site. So there are many places where there's limitation of movement and access for peoples on both sides. I can't go into Gaza, Gazans can't go into Israel. I can't go into Area A, Palestinians can go into Israel if they have a permit, but without a permit, they can't go into Israel. I can't live into an Area B, and many Palestinians can't live in many places in Area C. So this exists kind of on both sides, where there's limitation of movement, limitation of access to land, limitation of access to resources. And this kind of goes into the Palestinian side. First of all, they're living under a military that they have no representation towards. They don't vote. Those Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, not those living under Israel, don't vote for the Israeli government, and they're living under a military that controls aspects of their day-to-day lives, which is very oppressive. There are checkpoints which they have to go through, not only to go into Israel, but sometimes to go from community to community. You could be visiting your cousins and your family in a neighboring village, and there's a pop-up checkpoint that you have to go through, and all of a sudden you have to wait hours for no reason. Or maybe there is a reason, but it's a reality that they have to experience. Limitation of resources, sometimes electricity and water. Constant conflict that happens where sometimes people who have power within the military, excessively use that power and use it in an abusive way, and then harms individuals or even sometimes kills individuals. There's also the whole question of the right of return. For Palestinians, what's very important is for Palestinians not only in the land to feel freedom and justice and dignity, but also Palestinians living in the diaspora that are now maybe even second, third generation living in the diaspora, for them to be able to have the right of return, which doesn't currently exist. So that's a brief overview of the grievances and the injustices that both peoples are currently facing.
You mentioned the media there early and how it somewhat distorts the perspective of what's really going on, feet on the ground. So maybe talk a little bit about that. How reliable is the media when it comes to depicting what all is going on in the Middle East?
Yeah, I want to add something to what I was saying previously. Another element of grievance that the Palestinians face is also the dictatorship of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is, a brutal dictatorship. Anyone who's gay is executed, thrown off of a building. Anyone who criticizes the government is thrown into jail. Anyone who's a Fatah member, after when they took power, was killed, and their bodies were dragged on motorcycles in the streets. So it's a very oppressive dictatorship, and the Palestinian Authority is not much better. Also, being homosexual is illegal in the sense of you might be punishable by prison. People who oppose the government or who criticize the Palestinian Authority, they disappear for weeks on end. I work as a movement of Habayit that unites Israelis and Palestinians, and many of the Palestinians that we work with cannot put their faces publicly because of the consequences that happen if the Palestinian Authority knew their identity. And it's happened before where for 2-3 weeks, we don't hear of one of our activists, and they come back and tell us, listen, I'm sorry, I can't be a part of this anymore. Clearly showing that they've been traumatized, tortured, and even their families threatened. So that's a reality that also exists. In terms of media, the role of media is to speak to an audience, and usually that audience is very divisive. I don't know many media channels that are very inclusive of all views. It's usually to the right, or it's to the left, or it's for religious, or it's for secular. It's always towards an audience, and towards that audience they usually have a narrative, and so they feed into their narrative, they feed into their fears because they want more people to watch. And peace and love is not what sells in media, unfortunately. Maybe one day it will, but currently war and conflict is what sells. So if we focus and create hyper situations of a reality that's maybe a lot less than what the media is trying to produce, and try to pin on the emotions and play off of those feelings of weakness, of struggle, of pain, and play off of that in order to sell an image that there's one side that's good and one side that's bad, almost as if it's like a boxing match or a soccer game. You have to pick your team, you have to pick your fighter, and you have to be against, and every time the fighter hits the other one, you're cheering, and every time he gets hit, you're booing. And that's sort of what the media has created, taking a situation, rather than understanding it from an objective, holistic perspective, which there's always more work to be done and always more truth to be obtained. It's trying to divide people by playing on their emotions. And that's something that we saw recently with escalation that happened right now with what happened in Gaza, and previously to what was happening in Gaza, what was happening here in Jerusalem, is we saw medias trying to manipulate information and to avoid using the entire story. So for example, in Sheikh Jarrah, we're having a conversation right now of 8 homes and a claim on those homes of Jewish families, and the Palestinians that are living in those homes that are saying, well, we live here now and it's our homes. So even if one were to say, well, the Palestinians live there now, and I believe they have the right to go and live there, even if one had that claim, we're not talking about ethnically cleansing Palestinians versus Jews. We're talking about a dispute over 8 homes between families that have, in their own view, legitimate claims over those homes. But then to take a situation and to make it an entire population versus an entire population was one of the many attempts during that series of violence of media trying to push people against each other. Then what was happening in Al-Aqsa during Ramadan? There's Ramadan every year, and every year Ramadan lasts for a month, and every year for Ramadan, Muslims are able to go to Al-Aqsa and pray for their time of Ramadan, which is a very spiritual time. Jews at no point are able to go to that area, which again is our holiest place, which is a whole other story. But specifically what happened is you had Muslims, that individuals, not all, individual Muslim Palestinians that brought many rocks and were throwing rocks over to the Jewish side. There are videos of Jews running from where they were praying by the Kotel because of those rocks raining on their heads. And they started throwing rocks at police officers and shooting fireworks at the police officers. And what do you do in any sort of riot? The police goes and disperses the riots. Now they ran into the place where there's the mosque in itself, where people were praying, and they locked the doors and had many rocks and were ready also for that situation. And so they sort of led the police into dispersing a riot. Now, what does the media present? Oh, Israeli police has a problem with Muslims praying on Al-Aqsa during Ramadan and is kicking them out for praying. That is not what happened. In all the other days where there were no riots and no rocks being thrown at civilians, there was no issue. The issue started when the riots began. Or you have something else that actually I was there for it during Jerusalem Day, which was when the first rockets were fired from Gaza onto Jerusalem, which is something I had never experienced. I experienced many times rockets being blown up over my head while in bomb shelters, but never in Jerusalem did I experience something like that. And on Jerusalem Day, you had tens of thousands of people celebrating on the streets our holiday. And at the Kotel is where you have the final moment at night where you have a celebration. There's even a band. And you had individual Palestinians that got up onto Al-Aqsa and shot fireworks onto a tree. Not many fireworks up and one of the fireworks hits a tree. A series of 20, 30 fireworks aimed at a tree until the tree lights on fire. And the tree's on fire, which nothing else was caught on fire, just the tree. And Jews and Israelis were already dancing that entire day, celebrating their holiday. And someone takes a video of Jews dancing and a tree being lit on fire. And the media's report, Israelis light tree on Al-Aqsa on fire and dance to the flames. It's such a distortion of information. Like, again, if we truly want to understand the situation and fix the situation, let's not make things up in order to bring us away from the reality and bring us away from actually dealing with that situation. And there are plenty of other things that happen that way. And that there's also on the Israeli side, things that, are not taught in the right way. And that's why I think medias can be very dangerous. It can be helpful in some situations, but can also be very dangerous. So we have to be careful.
Yeah, that's very sad to hear. And, speaking real quick there about the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Temple Mount, I've just been curious. From what I recall, it was taken back by the Israeli government, but then given to the Muslims. Is that correct?
Currently, those who control Al-Aqsa is the Jordanian monarchy, Jordanian government, the Waqf, and those are the ones that have control. Jews can walk around it at certain times during certain days, under heavy security. In fact, there are 15 Israeli police officers that have to be with you, and they're not protecting you, they're controlling you, because if you recite a prayer, even silently, if you say it under your breath, you'd automatically be arrested and taken out. You can't even pray. You can wear a kippah, but you can't wear any other sort of spiritual items. So there's a lot of oppression that the Jews experience when coming to their holiest site. And so for me, it's very important that one day we also be able to pray there, but I definitely don't want Muslims to also not be able to pray there. I think this is the house of God, house of Hashem, house of Allah, and house of all those who believe in Allah and Hashem, which includes Muslims and Jews, and it should be accessed equally for all.
Why was it given to them?
I mean, there's a lot of things that in hindsight we can say, why did we do this? Why did we do that? But that was sort of a deal that they had made with the Jordanian Waqf, because they were afraid of the reaction of the Muslim world, of the Arab world, if that the Jews were able to take back this area and what they would do with it. So it was kind of like let's find a situation where an Arab Muslim country or kingdom would have control over this area. So we'd be able to liberate Jerusalem, but they would control it. So it's kind of like a middle ground in the way that they saw it.
I see. Okay. Louis, I think you had one other question there as well.
Yeah, I wanted to save this because I think all the other stuff should have been said first. Because I want to hear more about like what you believe is the best long-term solution to, you know, having an equitable arrangement that is suitable for both Israelis and Palestinians. Because I know you're critical of the two-state solution, and I'm curious to hear about what you believe is the better alternative to that.
Sure. This is a great question, but it's not a question that I have a specific answer to because of many things. This idea that we're going to print out a piece of paper, write in fine print the terms of the conditions for a solution, and that all the peoples are just going to accept this piece of paper, anyone trying to push that just doesn't understand how the Middle East works. The process for getting to a solution is a process. It's not something that's going to be imposed, it's something that's going to be achieved, and it's going to be achieved from a grassroots level, meaning by getting the peoples on the ground to an understanding, to a reality, working through the obstacles that we have. However, any sort of solution has to do two things. It has to fulfill the aspirations of both peoples, and it has to end the injustices that both experience. And a two-state solution does neither for either. It does not fulfill the aspirations of Palestinians or Israelis, and it does not end the injustices that we experience. In fact, it would create only more injustices. You'd have a civil war between Israelis because that would also require taking out 600 to 700,000 Jews out of Judea and Samaria, which they all have guns and they would fight that reality. So the injustices that would exist from trying to push that reality, let alone the aspirations that it wouldn't fulfill, is just a wrong approach to trying to find a situation and a solution to the situation. This idea of a two-state solution comes from the West. Has been one that always sought to divide the land and keep people fighting, either for British interest or, in my opinion today, there are interests of countries that profit from war with weapon companies that sell weapons to both sides and have reasons for this conflict to keep going. So to push this idea of division is something that I'm against. Now, in terms of what solution can exist, I have a dear friend of mine and colleague named Rabbi Yehuda Cohen, which gave an analogy that I think is very relevant to the situation and understanding how to view it. Let's say that you are a painter, and as a painter, you're seeking to create a masterpiece, a drawing, a painting. Before you actually pick the frame that you're going to use for the painting, you need to first come up with the idea. You need to pick your canvas, the texture, the size. You need to pick what type of paint you want to use. Do you want to use markers? Do you want to use paints, spray paint? What type of brushes? And then you start with your idea, and then eventually you figure out that you want to change the idea, or you mess up and you fix it. And only when you finish do you step back and say, well, you know what? Originally I thought I wanted a thick metallic frame, but now I actually realized that a thin wooden frame is what fits for this painting. And to talk about a solution right now is talking about the frame before the artists, the Israelis and the Palestinians, even come together to discuss what type of painting they want to create. So it's fine to theorize what type of future frames we can have. I think a valid theoretical solution is a form of a federation plan where there's more local autonomies and something that's built that achieves the aspirations of both. But it's healthy to theorize, but we have to remember that any conversation of a solution is theoretic until both peoples come together and start on that process and work on that process together.
I think Michael muted himself. Oh, there he is.
Sorry. No, I had to step away for just a second. I apologize. One of the last questions that I wanted to ask before we get to the chat questions, and by the way, go ahead and send them at Reason and Theologies just so I can pick them out from the comments. What would you say we here in the West can do to contribute towards, even in a minor way, towards a solution when it comes to the Israeli and Palestinian conflict?
It's a great question. First of all, any efforts that one does, it should never be from a place of wanting to divide. And if anyone is pro-Palestinian, they should definitely not be anti-Israeli. And if anyone is pro-Israeli, they should not be anti-Palestinian. Again, pushing these ideas that the only way one succeeds is with the destruction or the demise of the other is the very reason why we're in this conflict in the first place. Keep in mind that they're allies, so it's not up to them to tell Israelis and Palestinians what their experiences are and what their future should be. They should be coming from a position of trying to help, not trying to dictate and to impose and to tell others what their lives are, what their future reality should be. And I think if they're coming from a place of being healthy, meaning trying to help heal the situation and bring people together, then there's validity for their activism and for their voice.
Yeah. And one other question, what has been your experience with Christians? Have they generally been overly hostile to Jews in your experience, or supportive?
It really depends. There's so many Christians in the world that we cannot paint all Christians with one brush.
Right.
And I would say even amongst Christians, there's different streams and movements that have many differences. And also historically, certain streams were more violent against Jews and pushed, anti-Semitic theories or blamed Jews for the killing of Jesus. And many people don't do that today. Those same streams that don't do that today. So I can't generalize, but I can talk on the experiences that I've had that I think Christians should be aware of. For example, the cross. The cross to many Christians is a very holy symbol, right? It's something that's very special. To Jews, it's not holy because we don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah or that he is God, but it's also something that's actually very hurtful, because what happened on that cross? Jesus was killed on that cross. Jesus wasn't the only Jew killed on that cross. That cross was a method of killing Jews by the Romans. So for us, it's a weapon that has been used, or a tool that was used to kill many Jews. And so the symbol of it itself is something that is very offensive to Jews, not because it's spiritual to Christians, but of what it's meant to us in our experience prior to it even being a symbol and spiritual to Christians. So there's an element of nuance that I think many Jews, already understand, that this is a symbol that means this to Christians and it's not connected to what it means historically to Jews. But I think many Christians haven't heard the perspective of how Jews experience this symbol unrelated to how Christians experience it. Also, I think when someone is evangelical, that's great that they support Israel, but if they're supporting Israel from a position of, well, we want one day for someone to come back and for all the Jews to be killed if they don't convert to Christianity, and that's why we're supporting Israel, then in my opinion, that's not a support that I want. I don't want support at the cost of eventually in the future I'm going to be killed because I'm not accepting your belief system. So there are conversations that we need to have. But at the end of the day, I think, in my opinion, Jesus was a very righteous man, righteous revolutionary rabbi trying to change the world, was able to change the world in many ways. And his message was to create unity, to create oneness. And I think if we focus on his true message, I think that we can communicate between faiths, between identities, between spiritualities, between nations, in figuring out how to better understand each other.
Yeah, that reminds me of something there about the cross. When I was at school in Israel, we didn't use the plus sign like we do here in the United States. It was a different kind of plus sign. It's not crossed all the way through. Was that effectively because of what you were saying about the way the cross is perceived?
It could be. I'm not sure about that because I did most of my schooling in the United States. I was from 1st to 12th grade in the US, so I'm not sure about that. But I can tell you there are other things. For example, I went to Columbia University for my undergraduate degree, and on the Columbia cap and gown, the logo is a crown with 3 crosses. And I changed those crosses to Jewish stars because for me, I cannot wear a cross onto my body, not because I don't believe that Christians should wear a cross or that this symbol means something to Christians, but this symbol is a method of how Jews were killed historically, and not just with the Romans, but also with the Spanish Inquisitions, and that happened before and that happened after. So this was not a symbol that I was willing to put onto my body. I'm not advocating for the school to change their logo, it's their logo, but when it comes to wearing something on my body, I wasn't willing to do so. So I think those are nuances that are very interesting to have, but it's also delicate because some Christians can see that as, oh, you're against my cross. And it's important to understand that I'm not against your cross. This cross means something different, and it's spiritual to you because Jesus was killed on it. If you think about it and you add some nuance, Jesus was a Jew and other Jews were being killed that way. So you can understand how to the people that had an experience that was negative with that symbol because it represented them being killed by it, why they would not want to wear it on their bodies today.
Yeah, I think that is an important conversation to have for Christians to be aware of those differences. I see one here from Kyle in the chat. Would we likely see an entire one-state solution in the near future since the two-state solution doesn't seem likely? What do you think about that?
Yes and no. I think the premise of saying one state sort of implies that we're just going to see the extension of Israel extending to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and potentially also extending to Gaza. And I don't think the system that we currently have in Israel really works. Even if you look today, like how many elections did we go through in the past 2 years? And even the current coalition, we don't know how long it will last. And it's built of many people who are completely divided on their ideology, but are all united on hating the previous prime minister. So the system that we have here is not something that I think works. You look at the religious Jews, they feel the state is too secular. You look at secular Jews, they feel the state is too much religious. You look at Jews that are more, or Israelis that are more on the right, and they feel that the country is too to the left. And you look at the left, they feel it's too to the right. So the system that we built here, this British parliamentary system, is not one that I think works. So I think that we need to open up the conversation to one civilization. And one civilization is intentionally more vague because it allows room for potential other solutions other than just extending the current reality and governments that we have, or the situation that we have, extended onto other places in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and onto Gaza.
This one is from Haley. She says, have you heard or seen a growing number of right-wing anti-Semitics? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've definitely experienced plenty of people that are on the far right and are anti-Semitic. There are videos on YouTube where I'm debating some of these individuals, such as there's Nazi versus Jew videos that are there, part 1 and part 2, with people who have very extreme views. And my first experience with anti-Semitism, as I spoke earlier in the podcast, was with a neo-Nazi bus driver in London that physically threw my mom off the bus for being Jewish. He noticed that she was wearing a shirt in Hebrew and realized we were Jews and kicked her off for it. So I've definitely experienced a lot of far-right anti-Semitism, but far-right anti-Semitism is more obvious because it's very blunt. It's very in your face. They're not afraid. We have to be very careful of the far-left anti-Semitism, which tries to coat things and to hide things. So, for example, in Philadelphia, there was a food festival that just happened, and the Israeli food truck was not allowed to participate because they said they wanted to be more inclusive to their other participants. I mean, how ridiculous is saying that we want to be more inclusive and we're going to be exclusive and exclude you for your own identity? That person is just a normal human being who just so happens to be Israeli because he was born there and has a food truck. So the far left's anti-Semitism of excluding Jews is much more subtle and is hidden. So it's also sometimes much more dangerous. But it's two sides of the same coin.
Louis, I think you had a comment there.
Yeah, I actually have noticed this among what you would call the rad-trad Catholic circles, and I've had to deal with this fairly recently in our Discord channel. Actually, I was in a debate with someone over how should Christians interact with Jews, and the person I was speaking with was bringing up examples of past popes who decided to opt for the harshest possible measures against the Jews. And I pointed out to him that if you look throughout Christian history, there have been a variety of ways that Christians have interacted with Jews. There's, Pope St. Gregory the Great, who actually said that we should respect their freedom of religion and not try to stop them from attending synagogue or doing their festivals. And also there was St. Augustine, who believed that God actually permits the Jewish nation to continue to exist, and on that grounds they should not be forcibly converted. But unfortunately, seems like people like this, they have a tendency to focus in on the worst examples of Jewish treatment in church history and idealize that. It's a myopic reading of church history, in my opinion, but it serves a certain ideology that they've latched onto.
Any comments on that, Rudy, before I go on to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't represent all of Christianity, as both of you know. There are plenty of great Christians and many great individuals that are of the Christian faith, currently and historically. So the actions of individuals should not represent all. And unfortunately, you have some individuals that are trying to justify their hatred, even sometimes subconsciously. They don't even realize that they have a hatred against the Jewish people and are trying to find sources to justify that. And so they'll go through their religious texts, if they're religious, or religious individuals, and try to find things that then get them to their conclusion of justifying their ideology.
You know, one question that I have about this topic when it comes to anti-Semitism, one thing I've noticed is, let's say you have a Christian who wants to evangelize a Jew because they believe that, you know, through Christ is the only way to eternal life. So they evangelize them, not out of any kind of hatred, not out of any kind of disrespect, but because they want to share what they believe is a true gift. I've seen some Jews claim that that's an anti-Semitism. What are your thoughts there? Is that anti-Semitism?
I don't think it's anti-Semitism. It's not trying to deliberately attack or be against Jews, but it is very offensive because we have our own way of life and traditions that's specifically also from, you know, mainstream Christianity and the Pope and the Church throughout centuries. We were persecuted under, we were forcibly converted under, we were burned and expelled and exterminated for not partaking. So there's also a lot of that traumatic history that exists. And for someone to come and tell us, you know, you have to do this and to obsess about it, you know, because I run a Facebook and an Instagram and you know, different social media accounts with a lot of followers, and there's never one post without many Christians coming and talking about, you know, imposing Jesus onto us. Now, it's a very different thing as to saying, hey, let's have a conversation of who Jesus was as a person and what it means to me. I'd love to share it with you. If you're interested in learning, you know, you can learn about it. That's a very different approach than saying, let me tell you how your life is wrong, how you're living a lie, and you need to accept this and you need to do that. And add the element of, you know, for us historically, you know, we've have ancestors that were killed for not accepting Christianity. So it's not just someone coming up with a theory and saying, let me tell you about this theory. There's a lot of trauma that's added onto it. So I think it's about the approach. I don't think it's anti-Semitic. I do think many times it is offensive. And if that conversation is welcomed and it's two ways, then it's fine. But if that conversation is sort of an imposition and not willing to even listen to the other side when they're telling you, listen, I don't want to talk about this, and they just keep talking about it, then it gets a little bit excessive.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
In fairness, that's not a uniquely Jewish thing. I think anyone who's not a Christian will react the same way
Sure.
when they're being evangelized.
Yeah, I think so. This one is from Grant Michael. Is the USA the biggest ally for Israel overall?
Well, I'm actually writing an article about this. You know, I'm against the U.S. foreign aid to Israel. I don't think that America is an enemy of Israel. But there's been this sort of narrative that has been portrayed that Israel wouldn't exist without America's help. And in fact, if we look at the vast majority of Israel's accomplishments in the battlefield, it existed prior to the US becoming quote unquote allies with Israel, prior to 1967. Only after 1967, after the 6-Day War, did America start favoring and wanting to become allied with Israel. The reason for why I'm against the foreign aid is because it's not cash, it's not liquid money going into the pockets of Israel where they can do what they want. It's credit into military companies, weapon companies in America, which forces the Israeli military to be completely dependent on the US military. So what does that mean? 90% of that money has to be used to buy weapons and military technology in America, which has caused Israeli factories, such as factories that used to produce boots in Israel, jobs that were built in Israel to then go and be used in America. And now those companies are closed down. And if you look at the Israeli military, our guns, our boots, our planes, our bullets, our magazines, our bases, our gear, like so much of the things that we use day to day is all made in the US. What happens if one day, you know, there's a civil war in the US and, you know, we can't get that anymore? What happens if there is a president that is elected that is hostile to Israel way more than what currently exists? And let's say if we go towards a reality of where the political trajectory is happening, if you look on college campuses, that's a very big reality that can exist in Israel. Why should Israel wait for that day to be completely dependent on the US? But furthermore, there's lines that are included in this deal where Israel cannot buy weapons from any country without the approval of the US and cannot sell weapons to any country without the approval of the US. And I don't want Israel to be dependent on any country. I want Israel to have a relationship with the US. I don't want it to have a toxic relationship with the US. And if Israel has to buy or outsource something that it can't make in-house, then you should diversify. The first rule of business is don't put all your eggs in the same basket. So if it needs to go buy something outside, it should have at least the opportunity and ability to do so if it chooses to do so. So in my opinion, the structure of U.S. foreign aid is built in a way that makes Israel dependent on the U.S. in a way that I don't want to see. And that's I don't think it's really an ally. It's more like an agreement where there's similar values that may exist, but there's also a benefit of we're going to produce weapons and you need weapons, and we're going to sell you those weapons.
Dennis says, asks, independently from theological reasons, which might be legit, is it moral to claim land for historical reasons generations ago? Isn't it like if Mexico would claim Texas? What are your thoughts there?
Well, the thing about those situations is they're very different. Number one, since let's say the civilization that lived on the land of Mexico that used to include Texas, since then Texas now exists. And if we compare the situation with Israel being colonized by the Romans and the land being called Palestine, there was no state or kingdom that existed. It was just a territory. Now, instead of being called Israel, now called Palestine, that consisted of many different peoples, that was controlled by a foreign empire. So you didn't have an autonomous new country or state or kingdom that was built. Number two, if the people of Mexico actually sought to liberate their homeland, there would be an argument for it. There are two reasons and two arguments for legitimacy. It's either you are the ancient indigenous pre-colonial population that maintained a constant presence and seeks to eventually liberate their home, or you are the current power. It's similar to if we take the situation of Tibet. Tibet was a civilization. It was swallowed up by China. Many Tibetans were kicked out and are in the diaspora. And some people claim Tibetans should have a right to free Tibet, which I support. And some people claim that China now is the conqueror of Tibet, and it is what it is, and that's where we are today. And so they have the legitimate right. So there are two ways to claim legitimacy, and it just so happens that Israel has both. It is also the ancient civilization, indigenous pre-colonial identity on the land, and it is also the people that kicked out the British and won the defensive wars that were attacked and waged against it, and is currently the power that controls the land.
See one other question here. It is from Patrick. Is the kibbutz movement still a thing in Israel?
It's not the same as it used to be, but there are definitely still kibbutzim. I think a lot of the kibbutzim evolved to creating different things other than just agriculture. The system that a lot of kibbutzim worked under was that everyone would make money and would give it to the kibbutz, and the kibbutz would sort of allocate, the food and the education. The house would just give. There would be no individual money. You would have a salary, or you would have a sort of allowance that you would get from the kibbutz, but everything that you would work and do would be on the benefit of the kibbutz. And I think many kibbutzim have moved away from that structure. There's still a community element of it. There's still a sort of, sometimes agricultural production element of it. But many kibbutzim have, people who are living in their houses and are working in the city and are coming back and are having their own livelihood. And maybe they pay a certain fee for living in the community with the benefits that come with it. But the structure for the most part is different. But you still have some kibbutzim that exist the way it used to.
I want to actually take one more that I'm seeing here from Ave Maria. While we're discussing retaking the land, would you support retaking the Temple Mount and rebuilding the temple? What are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. The current people who control the temple are the Jordanians. It's a Hashemite kingdom from what is today called Saudi Arabia. It's called Saudi Arabia because the Hashemite family and the Saudi family fought for control over Arabia, and the Saudi family won, so that's why it's called Saudi Arabia. And the Hashemite family was kicked out and now control what is today called Jordan, and they have a control over the holiest place to the Jewish people and one of the holiest places to Muslims. They have many holy places, and I would say I think it's also the holiest places to Palestinians, even though they're Muslim. Large percentage of Palestinians, 30 to 60%, descend from Jews, and the relationship with Jerusalem and that specific location is way deeper than, let's say, some Muslim from Indonesia or Malaysia that has no connection to the land physically. So I think this is a place, the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa, is a location that is holy for all. In the Torah, it talks about this being a house of God for all, not just for Jews. So I believe it should be a place where there should be, whether the actual structure, the Golden Dome, which is actually not Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa is the gray, blackish dome next to it. The Golden Dome was built on top of what we believe to be the Croatian rock over there. And that was a place it was used to be called Bet el-Maqdis, which comes from Bet HaMikdash, which is the way we used to say the temple. I believe that whether we build next to it, build with it, or use the current structure that exists, whatever solution that would come out that would work for all peoples, it has to be a place of worship for Hashem, for Allah, for God, and for all peoples to be able to access, even those that don't live in the land.
Rudy, I really appreciate you coming on and laying out your perspective. Go ahead and put in a plug for your channel and anything else you want to make the audience aware of.
For sure. Type in my name, Rudy Rochman, RudyRochman, or on Instagram, Rudy_Israel. Israel is my Hebrew name. And check out on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, any social media platform that there is. And check out more of the videos where I touch on these things, go through debates, and break these ideas down.
Rudy, I really appreciate you coming on. I'd love to have you back on the show sometime if you're willing to just discuss other related issues.
For sure. Thank you for having me on and for having your audience being exposed to new ideas. I'd love to come on with a Palestinian next time if you're able to find one.
I really want to try to get that. Absolutely.
Preferably a Palestinian that isn't seeking to being antagonistic and turn this into a debate.
Sure.
The same way, if you had a Palestinian that was willing to talk about the future, you wouldn't want to bring an Israeli that was just trying to be anti-Palestinian. Right. Those are the best types of conversations.
Yeah, no, it would have to be somebody who is charitable and really interested in a resolution and dialogue. So I'll continue to try to find somebody. But hey, if you have someone in mind, shoot them my way. I'd love to host that.
Will do.
We'll be in touch. Everybody, thank y'all for watching. I appreciate y'all's comments, questions, all that good stuff. Don't forget to, of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and also check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support us and get access to extra content. Until next time, God bless.